The test of trust. The morning mist clung to the iron gates of Ashford Manor like silk draped over ancient stone. Beyond those gates stretched 12 acres of perfectly manicured lawns, rose gardens that bloomed in defiant beauty, and a limestone mansion that had housed 3 generations of wealth and twice as many secrets. Inside the grand entrance hall, Julian Ashford stood perfectly still, watching a stranger move through his home. Claire Montgomery had arrived exactly 1 week ago. She came with a single worn suitcase, references from a placement agency that checked out, and eyes that held stories she clearly had no intention of sharing. Her brown hair was always pulled back in a neat bun, not a strand out of place. She wore plain black trousers and simple white blouses that spoke of practicality rather than style. There was something almost invisible about her, as if she had perfected the art of not being noticed. Julian had hired her on a trial basis, something his estate manager Walter had arranged after the previous housekeeper retired. At 42, Julian ran a private equity firm that had made him wealthy beyond measure, but it had also taught him something darker. People were predictable in their greed. Show them an opportunity, and their true nature would eventually surface. It always did. He remembered his father's words, spoken in this very hallway 20 years ago. Never trust anyone who serves you, Julian. They smile while they plot. They bow while they betray. His father had been proven right when Julian was just 19. The family's longtime butler, a man Julian had called Uncle Bernard, had systematically embezzled hundreds of thousands before disappearing. Julian had learned his lesson early and well. Now, watching Claire dust the antique globe in the library, Julian felt that familiar skepticism rising. She was too perfect, too careful, too grateful for a job that paid modestly by mansion standards. In his experience, people who seemed too good to be true usually were. Walter approached quietly, tablet in hand. "The new security cameras are all operational, sir. Every room except the private quarters, as you requested." Julian nodded without taking his eyes off Claire. "Good. Let's see who she really is." The plan was simple. Julian would create an opportunity, a test of character that would reveal Claire's true intentions. If she was honest, she would stay. If not, well, he would have his answer and she would join the long list of people who had disappointed him. 3 days later, Julian set his trap. It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind of autumn day where golden light poured through windows and made everything seem softer than it was. He had dismissed most of the staff early, claiming he needed absolute quiet for an important conference call. Only Claire remained, tasked with her usual afternoon cleaning. In the east sitting room, Julian arranged his stage. On the mahogany side table, he placed his wallet containing $500 in cash. Beside it, his platinum Patek Philippe watch, worth more than most people's cars. Next to that, carelessly stacked, were 10 $100 bills held together loosely with a simple paper clip. It looked accidental, as if he had emptied his pockets and forgotten the items there. Then Julian positioned himself on the burgundy leather sofa nearby. He had changed into comfortable clothes, slacks, and a casual shirt, and arranged himself in a position that suggested he had simply fallen asleep while reading. The book lay open on his chest, his reading glasses perched on the armrest. Everything about the scene suggested vulnerability and opportunity in equal measure. Behind the oil painting of his grandmother on the far wall, a camera recorded everything. Julian had checked the angle twice. Nothing would be missed. He heard Claire's footsteps approaching down the hall, soft and measured as always. His heart rate increased slightly, not from nervousness but from the cold certainty that his suspicions would be confirmed. They always were. The door opened with barely a whisper. Claire entered carrying her cleaning caddy, the familiar collection of cloths and polish that accompanied her everywhere. Julian kept his breathing steady and deep, the perfect imitation of sleep. Through barely opened eyelids, he watched her pause in the doorway. Her gaze swept the room, landing first on him, then on the table. He saw her shoulders tense almost imperceptibly. There it was, the moment of recognition. She had seen the money. Now came the moment of truth. Claire stood completely still for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 seconds. Then, to Julian's surprise, she moved not toward the table but toward the windows. She began her work as if the money did not exist, wiping down the windowsills with careful attention to each corner. Julian's mind raced. Was this patience? Was she waiting for a better moment? The camera would catch everything. Claire worked her way around the room with methodical grace. She dusted the bookshelves, adjusted a picture frame that hung slightly crooked, picked up a dead leaf that had somehow found its way inside. All the while the money sat there, untouched, almost glowing in the afternoon light. When she finally approached the table, Julian's muscles tensed imperceptibly. Here it comes, he thought. But Claire did not reach for the money. Instead, she carefully lifted each item, wiped the surface beneath it, and placed everything back exactly as she had found it. Her fingers never lingered on the cash, never tested the weight of the watch. Then something unexpected happened. Claire looked at the money for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She glanced toward Julian, checking that he was still asleep. Julian felt a strange flutter of anticipation, mixed with that old familiar disappointment. Here it was, the moment she would reveal herself. But Claire did not take anything. Instead, she walked to the nearby desk and retrieved a leather folder that Julian used for important documents. Gently, almost reverently, she placed the folder over the money and watch, covering them from view. It was not the action of someone hiding their crime. It was the action of someone protecting another person's valuables from temptation or mistake. Julian felt something crack in his chest, a sensation he could not immediately name. Claire then moved toward him, and Julian's breath caught. What was she doing? Through his barely open eyes, he saw her reach toward the throw blanket draped over the nearby armchair. She unfolded it slowly, careful not to make noise, and approached the sofa where he lay. The blanket settled over him like a whisper, warm and unexpectedly gentle. Claire tucked it carefully around his shoulders, her movements tender in a way that felt almost maternal. Her hand hovered near his forehead for a moment, and Julian thought she might brush away the strand of hair that had fallen across his face. She did not touch him, but she leaned down, so close he could smell the faint scent of lavender soap, and whispered words that would echo in his mind for days to come. Thank you for giving me a chance when no one else would. I will never let you down. Then she gathered her cleaning supplies and left the room as quietly as she had entered, pulling the door almost closed behind her to keep out the draft. Julian lay there long after her footsteps faded. The blanket felt heavier than it should, weighted with something he could not define. For the first time in 20 years, since the day Uncle Bernard betrayed his family, Julian Ashford felt the armor around his heart shift. Not break, not yet, but shift. He had set a trap to catch a thief. Instead, he had found something far more dangerous, someone who might actually be exactly who she appeared to be. And Julian had absolutely no idea what to do with that. Seeds of something more. Julian sat alone in his private study long after midnight, the only light coming from the computer monitor in front of him. The security footage played on loop for the 7th time. He watched Claire enter the sitting room, watched her pause, watched her cover the money and then drape that blanket over him with a gentleness that seemed to belong to another century. He leaned back in his leather chair, rubbing his eyes. The rational part of his mind, the part that had built empires and destroyed competitors, insisted this was all performance. She knew about the cameras. She had to. But the footage showed something his cynicism could not explain away. When Claire had whispered those words, her voice had trembled. Her hands had shaken slightly as she tucked the blanket. Those were not the movements of someone playing a part. Julian closed the laptop and walked to the window overlooking the east garden. Dawn was still hours away, but he knew he would not sleep. That small crack in his armor had widened, and now something uncomfortable was seeping through, hope maybe, or the memory of what trust used to feel like before betrayal taught him better. The next morning arrived gray and heavy with the promise of rain. Julian found himself doing something unusual. He left his bedroom earlier than normal and took a different route to his study, one that happened to pass through the main kitchen. He told himself it was coincidence, but he knew better. Claire was there, as he somehow knew she would be. She stood at the large farmhouse sink, washing dishes that the night staff had left. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, and she hummed something soft and tuneless as she worked. She had not heard him enter. Julian watched from the doorway, hidden in shadow. There was something meditative about her movements, each plate cleaned, with the same attention as the last. No rush, no resentment, just steady presence. When she finished, she dried her hands carefully and turned to begin preparing the morning tea service. That was when she saw him. Claire startled, her hand flying to her chest. "Mr. Ashford, I did not hear you. I apologize. I should have started the tea earlier." "No need to apologize," Julian said, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. "I am awake earlier than usual." He paused, then added, "That was quite a kindness you showed me yesterday afternoon." The blanket. Color rose in Claire's cheeks. "You were awake?" "Not then," he lied smoothly. "But Walter mentioned he saw you checking on me. I wanted to thank you." Claire's expression shifted to something softer. "You look tired, sir. I thought perhaps you needed the rest more than the interruption." Julian studied her face, searching for calculation, for angles, for the hidden agenda that his experience insisted must be there. He found nothing but sincerity. It unsettled him more than any deception could have. "Do you take tea, Claire?" he asked suddenly. She blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Sir?" "It is a simple question. Do you drink tea?" "Yes, sir, but I usually wait until after the morning service is complete." "Have tea with me now," Julian said. It was not quite a command, not quite a request. "Consider it part of your duties. I find I prefer conversation with my morning tea." For a moment Claire looked like she might refuse. Then she nodded slowly. "As you wish, Mr. Ashford." They sat at the small breakfast table near the window, the one usually reserved for staff. Julian poured tea into 2 simple white cups, no ceremony, no formality. Rain began to tap against the glass, gentle at first, then growing stronger. "How are you finding the work here?" Julian asked, genuine curiosity coloring his tone. Claire wrapped her hands around her cup, as if drawing warmth from it. "It is more than I expected," she said carefully. "The estate is beautiful. The staff is kind. I feel fortunate." "Where did you work before?" Something flickered across her face. There and gone so quickly Julian almost missed it. Pain, perhaps, or shame. "Various places," she said. "Nothing as grand as this." Julian recognized evasion when he heard it, but he did not press. Instead he asked, "Do you have family?" "No, sir, not anymore." Her voice was steady, but Julian heard the weight beneath those words. They sat in silence for a moment, drinking tea, while rain drummed its rhythm against the world outside. Julian found himself studying her profile, the curve of her cheek, the way she held her cup with both hands like it was something precious. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense, but there was something luminous about her when she thought no one was watching. "Why did you not take the money?" Julian asked suddenly, the question escaping before he could stop it. Claire turned to look at him, her gray eyes meeting his directly for the first time. "Because it was not mine," she said simply. "I know what it feels like to have things taken. From you. I would never do that to someone else." The rawness in her voice struck Julian like a physical blow. This was not philosophy or virtue signaling. This was lived experience speaking. "What was taken from you?" he asked softly. Claire looked away, back toward the rain. For a moment, Julian thought she would not answer. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything that mattered. But I would rather not speak of it, if that is acceptable." Julian nodded. "Of course." They finished their tea in companionable silence, and when Claire rose to continue her duties, Julian found himself not wanting her to leave. It was an unfamiliar sensation, this desire for someone's presence without agenda or purpose. Over the following days, Julian found his routines shifting in small but significant ways. He began taking his morning coffee in the breakfast room instead of his study. He lingered in hallways where he might encounter Claire. He noticed things he had never paid attention to before, like how she always straightened the photographs in the hallway, making sure his late mother's portrait caught the best light. How she left small vases of fresh flowers in rooms that rarely received visitors, as if beauty mattered even when no one was watching. How she spoke gently to Walter when his arthritis was bothering him, offering to carry heavier items without making him feel diminished. One afternoon, Julian was working in his study when he heard an unfamiliar sound, laughter, bright and unguarded. He followed it to the conservatory and found Claire sitting with Margaret, the elderly cook, both of them giggling over something in an old photograph album. And then, Margaret was saying, tears of mirth on her weathered cheeks. Young Julian tried to bake a cake for his mother's birthday and somehow ended up with what I can only describe as a brick with frosting. Claire laughed, the sound like bells. How old was he? 16, old enough to know better. Margaret wiped her eyes. But bless him, he tried. His heart was always in the right place, even if his baking skills were not. Julian stood in the doorway, something warm and unfamiliar blooming in his chest. He could not remember the last time someone had laughed about him with such affection rather than mockery. Claire looked up and saw him. Her laughter faded into a soft smile. Mr. Ashford, we were just reminiscing about my failures in the kitchen, Julian finished, surprising himself with a smile. All true, I am afraid. Margaret has been trying to teach me for decades. Some people are meant to hire cooks rather than be them, Margaret said fondly. Nothing wrong with knowing your strengths, Julian. That evening, as dusk painted the sky purple and gold, Julian found himself in the garden. It had stopped raining, and everything smelled of wet earth and possibility. He did not expect to find Claire there, kneeling beside the rose bushes with a small pair of shears, carefully deadheading the spent blooms. You do not have to do that, Julian said, approaching quietly. We have gardeners. Claire looked up, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. I know, but I love roses. My grandmother had a garden full of them. I used to help her every evening. She paused, then added softly, It is one of my happiest memories. Julian crouched beside her, not caring that his expensive trousers would get dirty. Tell me about her. And Claire did. As twilight deepened around them, she spoke of a small cottage with climbing roses, of a grandmother who taught her that caring for living things was a form of prayer, of summer evenings that tasted like strawberry jam and contentment. She sounds wonderful, Julian said when Claire fell silent. She was. She was the only person who never gave up on me. Claire's voice broke slightly. When she died, I lost my home. My family did not want me. They said I was too much trouble, too much sadness. So I left. Julian felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest. Their loss, he said firmly. And my gain. Claire turned to look at him, surprise evident in her expression. You really mean that? I do, Julian said, and realized with startling clarity that he meant it completely. They stayed there in the garden as stars began to appear, talking about roses and grandmothers and the small kindnesses that make life bearable. And somewhere, between twilight and darkness, Julian Ashford felt the last of his armor begin to crumble. That night, the rain returned with fury. Julian was working late when the power flickered once, twice, then died completely. Emergency lights kicked in dimly, but most of the estate fell into shadow. He grabbed a flashlight and went to check on the staff quarters, ensuring everyone was safe. As he passed the main kitchen, he saw light flickering inside. Not electric light, but candle light. Claire stood at the window, trying to secure a shutter that had come loose in the wind. Rain poured through the gap, soaking the counter and her dress. She was shivering violently, but she kept trying to fix the latch, determined to protect the estate even at her own discomfort. Julian did not think. He simply moved. He crossed the room, gently moved Claire aside, and secured the shutter with strength she lacked. Then he shrugged off his jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders. You are freezing, he said, his voice rougher than intended. The house, Claire started. The house will survive. You need to get warm. He guided her away from the window toward the small sitting area adjacent to the kitchen where emergency heating had kicked in. Claire sat, pulling his jacket tighter. It smelled of expensive cologne and something uniquely him. Julian disappeared for a moment and returned with a thick blanket and 2 mugs of something hot. "I found tea in the cupboard," he said, handing her a mug. "It is probably terrible. I'm not Margaret." Claire laughed weakly and sipped. It was indeed terrible, oversteeped and too sweet. But it was warm, and he had made it for her. "It is perfect," she lied kindly. They sat together as the storm raged outside. The emergency lights cast everything in amber warmth, creating an intimacy that daylight would have prevented. "Why do you work so hard?" Julian asked quietly. "You could do the minimum and still keep your position, but you do not. Why?" Claire was silent for a long moment, staring into her terrible tea. Finally she spoke. "Because when you have lost everything, when people have told you that you are worthless and unwanted, proving them wrong becomes a kind of survival. Every window I clean, every flower I arrange, every small thing I do well is proof that I matter, that I have value." She looked up at him, eyes glistening. "Does that sound foolish?" "No," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. "It sounds like the bravest thing I have ever heard." Something shifted in the air between them, subtle but unmistakable. Julian reached out slowly, giving Claire every chance to pull away, and brushed a wet strand of hair from her face. His hand lingered against her cheek, warm against her cold skin. "You matter," he said softly. "You always have. I was just too blind to see it." Claire's breath caught. She leaned slightly into his touch, a gesture so trusting it made Julian's heart ache. They stayed like that, the storm outside, warmth inside, 2 people who had both learned not to trust finding something fragile and precious in each other. "I should go," Claire whispered, but she did not move. "Stay," Julian said. Not a command, a plea. "Just until the storm passes." So she stayed. They talked through the night about childhoods and losses, about dreams abandoned and hopes barely held. And as dawn broke gray and gentle, Julian realized something that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. He was falling in love with his housekeeper, and for the first time in 20 years, he was willing to risk his heart again.